2023, it was an up and down season, hills and valleys for the Minnesota Golden Gophers, but can PJ Fleck get Minnesota back to that 8 or 9 win level in 2024? Ryan Burns of Gopher Illustrated and Minnesota 247 joins me to talk all things 2024 Minnesota Golden Gophers football.
From LA to Piscataway, all Big Ten all year long. This is Big Ten 10.
After a little bit of a down 2023, the Minnesota Golden Gophers are looking to get back to a winning season under PJ Fleck once again. To talk all things 2024 Minnesota Golden Gophers football, we welcome in Ryan Burns from Gopher Illustrated. The Minnesota site as a part of the 24/7 Sports Network, also in podcast land with Gopher Radio and the Pair and a Spare podcast. Ryan, when I look at 2023, I think there's a little bit of a mixed bag, maybe some mixed feelings in Gopherland a little bit. They were finally able to defeat the Iowa Hawkeyes under PJ Fleck. They beat Nebraska, right? So those are two big wins right off the bat, but they do finish 5-7. But they find their next great running back in Darius Taylor, and yet again, he's kind of banged up throughout the season and doesn't complete the full year. Ethan Kaliakmanis, inconsistencies kind of rear their head once again. He ends up transferring out. How would you kind of handicap last season and then how that kind of flows into 2024?
It was such an odd year, to be honest with you, from that opening game against Nebraska where Minnesota stages a late fourth quarter comeback, ends up winning, and then has success. They're up 3 scores in the fourth quarter against Northwestern, find a way to blow it, and then they're not able to obviously hang on. And then you also have the Illinois game where Minnesota's winning, up a touchdown, backup quarterback comes in, 4th down, 3 plays later, 85 yards later, they end up losing the game. And that's where I almost look at it. Yes, they were 5-7, ended up winning the bowl game 6-7, but they should have been 7-5. If you win a game on the road where you're up 3 scores in the fourth quarter, and then you don't make the Illinois backup quarterback look like Johnny Unitas in the final 3 plays of the game, and then you don't go cover 2 where Isaiah Williams is the only thing that Illinois can throw the ball to, very talented slot receiver, and you ask a linebacker to carry him 40 yards down the field. It's an interesting choice, but that's where it's just a season where they didn't finish. And that's the frustrating part about it. They are able to finally get over the hump against Iowa, which you mentioned was very important. Finally able to beat Kirk Ferentz. But I think we'd look at last season a little bit differently if they were able to finish those 2 games. But the reality was they weren't able to. Too many injuries on the defensive side of the ball where that really just killed anything resembling a run defense. They gave up way too many explosive plays. And then offensively, to your point, Darius Taylor's really good, but when you give Darius Taylor as a true freshman 92 touches in 14 days, turns out his body can't withstand that kind of workload. And then Ethan was very inconsistent. We'll see if he's able to find it at Rutgers with Kirk Shiraka now back with him, but just too much inconsistency from game 1 all the way through game 12.
All right, let's start first on the offense and at the quarterback position. You bring in Max Brosmer from New Hampshire. Now, transitioning from FCS to Big Ten. That's a pretty sizable jump, but when you turn on the tape of Max at UNH, it looks pretty good, and then you look at his stats year by year at UNH, also looks pretty good. A lot of people in Gopher fans are kind of looking at this as an upgrade at the quarterback position. What does Max bring to the table that might make this seem like an upgrade in the passing game this year?
Well, I would say off the field first, the biggest thing he brings is a lot of leadership, a lot of, I hate the cliches of, watches a bunch of film, he grinds it, stuff like that. But it certainly has been made apparent to me that the moment Max Brosmer got here, he was immediately in the film room, first one in, last one to leave. He's putting in all the time with his receivers, his offensive line, his running backs. He's sitting in all those position meetings, trying to figure out what does each one of them do really well. And so he can try to figure out how to continue to work with offensive coordinator Greg Harbaugh to integrate a better passing game, because you know it as I do, this passing game has been a travesty for years. They haven't been able to go to it. They tried to last year to start the season against Nebraska. They threw it 40 plus times. They thought they were going to be able to, and then Athan couldn't handle that. And that's where with Max Brosmer now, I think the biggest thing you're going to see is when you look at the tape from New Hampshire was a short passing game. He's a guy who loves to throw it to the tailbacks and the tight ends. Now, it also helps that his best player on the New Hampshire offense the last couple of years was Dylan Lobb, who, if fans don't know, was a 5th-round draft pick of the Las Vegas Raiders as his running back. So not often in the CAA you get to have many NFL draft picks. So I would imagine that's part of why he threw it to the running back so much. But Darius Taylor is more than capable. C.A. Bangura, their transfer they took from Ohio, caught 50 passes during his time there. I think you're going to see them try to integrate more, because if you're defending a Minnesota offense historically here, at least recently, you know it's going to be inside, mid, and outside zone, and probably a play action deep shot. Well, if they can just get something resembling a short passing game to where, if on the days this year where you can't run the football, if you can just get to 2nd and 5, 2nd and 6, 2nd and 4, that play sheet for Greg Harbaugh is going to get a lot longer if you can be in 2nd and 3rd and manageable. So if they're going to take a step forward, I think that's where it's going to be. But to your point, Max Brosmer, I think, is going to be an upgrade. You look at even the Senior Bowl. Again, it's not the end-all be-all. They just released their preseason watch list. There were 6 Big Ten quarterbacks on there, and Max Brosmer was one of them. So I know a lot of people are skeptical of the transition from FCS to Big Ten. I'm among them. But I would say that if Minnesota can just get consistent quarterback play, that's certainly going to be an upgrade for this team.
Everybody's looking at that 2019 season, right? Because that was the balanced attack. And, of course, that was the best Minnesota season in recent memory. And since then, it's become so heavy run. You mentioned the short passing game that you're confident in, and when you look at Max and what he was able to do at UNH. What about stretching the football down the field? Do you think that this is going to be a passing game that is going to look down to the medium and long passing concepts a little bit more, or is this going to be, maybe pretty similar to what we've seen in the past?
Well, I even think back to that 2019 season. I wouldn't say they threw it with a bunch of volume. They were just incredibly efficient and explosive. Now, that's what happens when you have Tyler Johnson and Rashad Bateman, 2 NFL draft picks, 2 guys that were both first team all Big Ten. I think that's the first time that's happened in Minnesota history, and if not Big Ten history, where 2 receivers from the same school end up on the first team all Big Ten list, which is crazy to say considering the amount of talent that Ohio State puts out, especially receiver wise on a given year. I know that was true back in 2019, but to your point, I think they're going to want to be more explosive. It's one of the areas where Minnesota really struggled last year, was they couldn't generate enough explosive plays on offense. Now, if you can have a more balanced outlook, which I'll say this, I think Minnesota throws more this year than they have in any other year in the Fleck era. Now, that's dependent upon Max Brosmer being consistent, which I'm going to expect him to be able to, but they're going to need somebody not named Daniel Jackson to step up. Minnesota's lone all Big Ten pass catcher returning. He's very talented, and he's going to get a bunch of targets. I mean, even last year, he had a 35% target share. I mean, he's seeing 10, 12, 14 targets a game. But if Minnesota's going to throw 28 times, there's still another 50% of the targets that got to go somewhere, and you're losing most of your top pass catchers from last year. So the question comes down to, for me, if they're going to become more explosive, if they're going to take more shots down the field, does Charlotte transfer Elijah Spencer find it in year 2? Was very productive in his early years at Charlotte, transfers to Minnesota, only catches 9 balls last year. He's going to be expected to take a step forward this fall. Someone like Lemeke Brockington, the hero of the 2022 Wisconsin game, where he takes a slant to the house, 4th quarter to win it. Or even some younger guys like Tyler Williams, a transfer they took from Georgia, maybe someone like Nuke Hayes, a redshirt freshman. They need guys to step up if they're going to be able to stretch the field more.
So true that beyond Daniel Jackson, they need something. If they don't have something, they could maybe lean a little bit more into that run game, and let's talk about that run game. Of course, the emergence last year of Darius Taylor. When I watch him, and really the games that he was able to be explosive, the games that he was actually on the field for last year, you can definitely see one of the Big Ten's best running backs. He could be, I should say, this upcoming season. What about him makes him such a great back?
He's just so explosive to me. For a guy that's 6 foot plus, 200 pounds plus, you put on the tape of what he did against Northwestern or North Carolina or in the bowl game, he's able to make men miss in a variety of different ways. He can run through you, or he can run around you, whatever that may be. And he's so good in yards after contact. I mean, I think of that 4th down run against Northwestern where he bounces off a very experienced Northwestern linebacker in the hole, spins out of it, and runs away for a touchdown. I would love to be able to see Darius Taylor get 200 touches this fall. I would love to be able to see Darius Taylor play in 10-plus games, because if he does, he's going to be an all Big Ten running back. There's no doubt about it in my mind. But I think Minnesota's now understood that, as I mentioned earlier, 92 touches in 14 days, and then he gets injured immediately, pretty quickly into that Iowa game after that. You can't expect a young man like that to be able to carry the load, which is why they brought in 3 different transfer running backs, I think, to try and to be able to get him around 20 touches a game. That's still plenty of touches for him. 15 to 17 carries, 3 to 5 targets in the passing game. Keeping him healthy and keeping him fresh is going to be a huge focal point. But he is a very gifted runner. I mean, we've seen some really good running backs in the last decade from the University of Minnesota. Guys like David Cobb, Rodney Smith, Mo Ibrahim, Shannon Brooks among them. I mean, there's been a lot of talented backs, and I think Darius, if he can find health in 2024, is going to start to pencil his name with some of those really good players.
A big reason why Max Brosmer at quarterback and a lot of these running backs are excited is because what's in front of them. The offensive line. When you start to look at maybe some Big Ten offensive lines, you can see why Minnesota fans are excited, because they've got a really good group coming back. Arante Urzi started all games at left tackle the last 2 seasons. You look to the other side, and this is going to make Max Brosmer smile from ear to ear. Quinn Carroll started every game at right tackle the last 2 years. The Edina, Minnesota native, transferred over from Notre Dame a couple of years back. He was honorable mention all Big Ten. You look to the middle, Tyler Cooper started 11 games at left guard. How about Martez Lewis? Started every game at right guard. Do you think the offensive line kind of holds the key of how good this offense can be in 2024?
It needs to be a strength for sure. I mean, they returned 4 of their 5 starters up front, and the 5th guy would be Greg Johnson, who started games for them, and he's now going to be penciled in at center. So it's just going to be about how do they continue to just kind of figure out these moving parts. And what I mean by that is, to your point, I think they're going to have the best left tackle that they've had in the Fleck era with Ariante Ursary. I mean, to your point, he started the last couple of seasons, was all Big Ten last year. I think he is very gifted. Someone, if he takes another step forward this fall, he's going to be a top, probably a day 2 pick next year. He's got that type of ability. You mentioned Quinn Carroll. Minnesota's really trying to move him inside this year. Okay. That's where he's been above average, according to the Pro Football Focus grades, as a run blocker, but he's struggled in pass protection. He's given up the most pressures on this offensive line the last 2 years. And so they're going to try to move him inside to guard, where at right tackle, then it's going to be a battle between Martez Lewis. Aluma Nakili is a transfer they took from UTEP, or I think probably my projected starter there right now is a redshirt freshman by the name of Phillip Daniels. We'll see how that all works forward in through fall camp. But to your point, I mean, they're very old up front. They should be outside of potentially right tackle and center there with Greg Johnson in his second year, potentially Phillip Daniels in his second year at right tackle, but they're going to be old. They're going to be experienced. And, with a Brian Callahan-led offensive line, I think their claim to fame has been, at least these last few years, all 5 starters have been at least honorable mention here in the Big Ten. And if that's the case, or if Quinn Carroll can take a jump in his last year here on the inside and become all Big Ten, Max Brosmer, these running backs, and these pass catchers are going to benefit from that.
Let's start first on the defensive line, really, when we talk about position groups on this defense. There are some things to like, right? You return the 2 guys that led you in sacks and tackles for loss last season. That's Danny Strigow and John Joyner. You bring a hometown kid back. Jackson Howard went to LSU for a year. Now he's coming back. You've got Jalen Logan Redding kind of in the middle. How do you expect this defensive line to kind of shake out this year?
They should be the strength of this defense, and then they need to be, because Minnesota's got some brand new safeties they're going to be working in. I think you also look at corner, but defensive line wise, they need these guys to be as good as they should be, because they returned 6 of their 8 guys from their defensive rotation from last year. And to your point, they also added in Jackson Howard from LSU. Now, I'm probably a little bit lower than consensus on him for 2024 specifically. Again, it's just his second year in college football. He's only a redshirt freshman. I don't have lofty expectations for him immediately. He's going to have to beat out Carter Menz and some other players there at the rush end position. But if they can get 300 snaps out of the young man from Robbinsdale Cooper there, I mean, that would be a huge get for them. But to me, it comes down to Ja Joyner is really, really good. He's one of the best pass rushers in America when you look at the Pro Football Focus pass rush win rate. I mean, can he get some other help? Because I can assure you, every opposing offensive line coach and every opposing offensive coordinator is going to be sending a tight end or a running back to chip him on most of these passing downs. Well, that's great, but that's going to open up one-on-one opportunities for other guys like Danny Strigow, Devin Eastern, Jalen Logan Redding, among others along this defensive line. I even think a guy like Anthony Smith can take a big jump here, hopefully in year 3, because he looks the part. And when he got his opportunities here, he played 300 snaps for that defensive line last fall. He showed flashes, but if they can get consistency from someone not named Ja Joyner in the pass rush, that would be massive, especially on the interior. I mean, especially in college football, if you can get interior pressure on a quarterback, I mean, the whole thing just goes pear-shaped in a hurry for whatever the college quarterback is. So it's great, and that can only help as well Ja Joyner, which part of the reason why you look at his stats last year, so many pressures, so many hurries, and not enough sacks. Well, if the quarterback can just step up in the pocket and he can just step up in and around Ja Joyner bending the edge, I mean, there's only so much value in that. Pressures and hurries are valuable, but if you can get interior pressure from someone like Devin Eastern or Jalen Logan Redding, or we'll see if they can, again, in these Corey Heatherman blitz packages, potentially get A and B gap pressure, it's going to be big. But I know Ja Joyner is an all Big Ten caliber player, but it's can the Devin Easterns and the Jalen Logan Reddings, Danny Strigows, Anthony Smiths of the world take that jump from they played a bunch of football last fall. Now, can they play at an above average to really good level in the Big Ten is going to help dictate their success.
Boy, there's a big reason why Big Ten programs were looking to spend some big time money on defensive tackles, right? Because that is an important part to your defense. No question about that. We mentioned the loss that was Joe Rossi, right? A loss that is certainly within that category is losing Tyler Nubin at safety, maybe an all-time Gopher back there in that secondary. This was a defense. You mentioned injuries that can certainly contributed to things. It was the 10th ranked passing defense in the Big Ten last season. You can't replace a guy like Tyler Nubin, but what other pieces can you expect to attempt to fill the shoes that kind of Tyler left behind at the safety spot?
Yeah, Minnesota's safety development has been really good under PJ Fleck. I mean, you look at the last 2 free safeties, you go from Antoine Winfield Jr. to Tyler Nubin.
Pretty good.
Now, I think people have to remember in the early years of Antoine Winfield and even the early years of Tyler Nubin, there were growths that had to happen. Development, as you know, in college football is not linear, especially in those early years. I think this year, as you see Minnesota try to figure out what does life look like at free safety, is it going to be Coleman Bryson? Is it going to be Kerry Brown? Is it going to be All-American Coy Parrish coming in, Minnesota's highest rated recruit from this last recruiting class, who they beat out Ryan Day and Ohio State for at the last minute? It's just whoever this guy is going to be, I would just temper expectations for year 1 as the starter. There's going to be flashes. I think Minnesota feels pretty good specifically about Coleman Bryson or Kerry Brown there. But we're talking about a guy who is a third-year player in Coleman Bryson, and then Kerry Brown, who started the bowl game for them there with Nubin sitting out, is going to be a second-year player. These guys have to just play football and understand what they can get away with, what they can't, how translating coming down into the box to make that open field tackle is going to look versus taking that center field approach over the top and pass game. I mean, I just think for the safety position, there's going to be some learning curves there, but I do think they have some bodies. It's just getting those bodies up to speed. As early as that North Carolina game, I think is going to be a tough test for safeties coach Danny Collins.
Justin Walley seems to have that cornerback 1 spot locked in. Man, it seems like he's been playing football forever here at Minnesota. But what about the other side and maybe the nickel spots? Who do you kind of see filling in those spots in the secondary?
Yeah, for Justin Walley, I think it's a big year. I mean, it's his last year here at Minnesota. He's going to be a 4-year starter. But that growth we were looking to see last year between year 2 as the starter to year 3, I don't know that the step was as big as many hoped for, including myself. There were inconsistencies where I think back to that Northwestern game, getting beaten a double move before halftime. That can't happen. especially from a very veteran corner. And then, I mean, recency bias, obviously a thing, but in the bowl game against Bowling Green, they went at Justin Walley and they had success. And so that's where I would love to see between year 3 now and year 4, that all Big Ten caliber corner really show up consistently, where he's a playmaker, really good in the run game. Now, on the other side of things, Minnesota loses a transfer corner by the name of Trey Jones, who graduates. They took another one from the portal who's expected to be the starter, a young man by the name of Ethan Robinson, someone who was all CAA for Bucknell.
A healthy Cody Lindenburg is so key for Minnesota in the middle of that defense, right at that linebacker spot. As we mentioned, he kind of missed a lot of time last season. That certainly affected the way Minnesota approached maybe the defensive side of the ball. If he's ready to go, what kind of boost did that give this Minnesota defense?
If Cody Lindenburg's healthy, Cody Lindenburg is the best player on this defense. And I think he's in the same tier as Ja Joyner, to be quite frank with you. I think that if he can just prove his health, I think in a couple of years he's going to be an NFL draft pick. I mean, he is everything you want a linebacker to be. He's 6'2 plus, 240 pounds. He can run sideline to sideline. He can carry tight ends or running backs in the passing game. It's just about health. I mean, he has all the physical attributes in the world, and he's going to be the leader of this defense. He's going to be calling the defense now with the helmet communication from the defensive coordinator. He's going to have the one with the green dot on the side of his helmet. I mean, he is going to, everything needs to run through Cody Lindenburg. And if he does, it should be a 100-plus tackle season. I mean, I've been the high man on him out of high school. I've firmly planted my flag on that hill, and I know I'm going down with the ship at this point, because there's a lot of fans that aren't particularly, I mean, the way it went last season for him was about a 10% outcome. Just getting this fall camp injury, and then it just nags and nags through the season, re-injures something else, and Minnesota only gets about 2.5 games out of him. I mean, that's not ideal under any circumstance if your best linebacker just isn't on the field. And so for Cody, he was healthy this spring. He's been healthy so far this summer. There's a lot of expectations for him internally. I mean, I think if Cody Lindenburg plays in 10-plus games this fall, he should find himself on an all Big Ten list. But for him, it's tough to make the club when you're always in the tub. And so he just needs to always be on the field, and he needs to find health. And I know he and the training staff are working hard on that.
Boy, what a couple of names for Big Ten linebackers, Lindenburg and Barnaowski. We're just missing a couple of neck rolls, I think, right, from days gone by. Maverick Barnaowski and Devin Williams, I thought, did a solid job kind of filling in. With them kind of filling into those spots, how does that linebacker room kind of shake out?
And to your point, Barnaowski even does have the neck roll. So you think back to the days of, 80s and 90s linebackers with giant neck rolls, just crazy, crazy players. I mean, Barnaowski's trying to lean into that a little bit. I mean, to your point, we saw flashes from both Barnaowski and Devin Williams last season as they got their feet wet for the first time in the Big Ten. I mean, there were games where, like against Iowa, they both played really well. Were filling gaps, made plays in the passing game, got into their drops, and they were a huge part of why Minnesota was able to emerge with the Floyd of Rosedale. It's just in the other games, they looked inexperienced, which they certainly were. And so for them, it's trying to, one of the things that PJ Fleck has talked about, especially for those two in that other linebacker spot. Now, Devin Williams was recovering from some offseason cleanup throughout spring ball, so he wasn't a major factor. But especially into the summer and fall here, it's competing with each other, not against each other, because I think both of them know linebacker injuries are going to happen. It's just college football. It's a very violent game, a very violent position. So both of them have to be ready for their opportunities. I think if you asked me today, I'd probably lean Barnaowski 55-45 over Devin Williams just because he was healthy in the spring. He got to work with Corey Heatherman. But Minnesota, that's a position they really need to shore up because so many guys got their feet wet for their first times in the Big Ten last year, whether it was those two, whether it was Tyler Stolsky, whether it was Matt Kingsbury. I mean, I think there's going to be a healthy competition there, but there needs to be a jump for all of those guys from year one to year two in the Big Ten.
I feel good about Minnesota's roster as a whole. I think there's some potential here. And as we kind of venture into that schedule, I feel like that first game against the North Carolina Tar Heels, the now Drake May-less North Carolina Tar Heels, is going to tell us a lot about the Gophers, what they're going to look like over the next 11 games. How big of an impact do you put on game number one on that Thursday night?
I mean, it's a huge game. It always is, especially when you start off on a Thursday night game on national television, like it will be on Fox. To your point, I am as curious as anyone to see what this North Carolina team looks like without Drake May. Because I don't think if you were to ask North Carolina, if you give them some truth serum, I think they'd probably tell you they don't feel particularly good about the quarterback position. I know they took a former Tar Heel back from the transfer portal at that spot. I wouldn't be shocked to see North Carolina do 2 quarterbacks in that game. But when you look at the Vegas odds for that game, I think Minnesota is about a field goal favorite right now at home. Mm-hmm. I mean, this is a game you have to win. If you're going to be able to go to a bowl game this year, which I think should be the expectation for this team, I mean, North Carolina without Drake May doesn't scare me a ton. I mean, they certainly have skilled position players like Omarion Hampton, who is a very gifted running back, and Minnesota struggled immensely to stop the run. But this is a game you have to win. You're at home. I mean, yes, there is a change defensively for North Carolina with Jeff Collins now calling the defense, but this is a game where if you're Minnesota, especially up front, you're going to have to find a way to really set the tone between Big Ten to ACC physicality. To your point, we've talked about the offensive and defensive lines for Minnesota. They return a lot of experience from last year there. They need to be able to demonstrate that in game 1.
And this hasn't been a great Tar Heels defense. I think I might be putting that a little bit lightly over there. So controlling the line of scrimmage, keeping their offense off the field might work into the Gophers' favor. You look at the rest of the schedule. They draw Michigan, Penn State, and USC. You got the Nittany Lions and the Trojans, both coming to Huntington Bank Stadium, which certainly plays into the Gophers' favor. Do you have a ceiling on this team? Or when you start to look at the rest of the schedule, how do you see maybe this thing shaking out? Because as you said, you got to get back to that bowl game. Well, they got to a bowl game last year, but maybe bowl eligibility is a better way to put it.
Yeah, I'm a little surprised that Vegas is as low on Minnesota as they have been. I mean, when you look at the Vegas, when it opened for win totals, they were at 4.5, which was lowest in the Big Ten with Purdue, which shocked me a little bit because this team has been very consistent under PJ Fleck, especially the last 5 years. And they've been making bowl games. They've been in that 6 to 8 to 9 win range. And then that 2019 season, 10 regular season wins, and then an 11th win over Auburn. And the way I kind of look at this schedule, there's 2 games you're going to win. Rhode Island and Nevada at home there in the non-conference. Yep. There's 2 games where you're going to be a double-digit underdog. That's Penn State. That's Michigan. But I would say within that, then you have 8 games where you're going to be within a touchdown spread one way or another. And if you just flip a coin and it comes up heads half the time, you're at 6-6. But there's so many of these games where it's going to be so interesting to me because I don't know that, like, if you were to talk about variance this year, like if you were to put Minnesota's season on a bell curve, I think this year for me, it's as spread out of a bell curve as I've seen in some time, just because as much as I'm saying that about Minnesota, I think there's so many of these other teams that are in the same spot as Minnesota. They got a brand new coordinator somewhere, and maybe most importantly, the most important position in football, the quarterback. So many of these teams are going to be breaking in a brand new transfer quarterback from somewhere. So just like with the connection between Max Brosmer and Greg Harbaugh, how does it look for so many of these teams? I mean, we talked about North Carolina already. You go down the list, Cade McNamara, how does he look? Is he healthy? Or is it going to be Brendan Sullivan? Michigan breaks in a brand new quarterback. You got the Miller Moss era out there at USC. UCLA is going to have a brand new quarterback. Same thing goes for Maryland, Illinois. You have the revenge game between Ethan Kaliak-Manis, Kirk Shiraka, and this Minnesota team. And then Wisconsin at the end of the season as well. So to me, it comes down to who has a really good quarterback and who doesn't. And I just think so many of these quarterbacks, including Max Brosmer in Minnesota, we just don't know a lot about in terms of how is it going to fit. I think there's a lot of talented quarterbacks that Minnesota is going to go against on the schedule. To me, I would set the line at 6 wins for Minnesota. I could see 8 if it goes really well. I think that'd be a really good season for them. And if it doesn't, if quarterback injuries happen and then Minnesota has to go to a freshman quarterback, you know how that's going to go like I do. So I think just so much of this season comes down to health, which quarterbacks in the Big Ten are particularly good. But again, you look at the schedule, you get to miss, in my opinion, the 2 best teams in the Big Ten in Oregon and Ohio State. But again, Michigan and Penn State, you're going to probably be 2 touchdown underdogs in those games, and rightfully so. Prove that you can stay in those type of games and win. But there's so many other games on this schedule where if you can just, especially in between the bye weeks, you talk about a home game against Maryland, on the road in Champaign, on the road against Rutgers. I mean, that's a stretch you have to go 2-1 if you're going to be bowling if you're Minnesota.
Boy, when I look at the whole Big Ten this year, one word comes to mind, and it's chaos. You know, you don't have the divisional structure. You've got 4 West Coast teams that have a different, maybe, football culture than the rest of the Big Ten teams do. And then you mentioned, I think there's going to be a lot of close games, and Minnesota's one of those teams. I think they're going to be in a lot of the one-score games. Got to be able to win those. Won them against Nebraska last year. Was able to do it against Iowa. Can they do it against a lot of the other teams? Ryan Burns, Gopher Illustrated. Appreciate you joining me and talking some Gopher football today.
Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for watching Big Ten TED, where it's all Big Ten all year long. Make sure to like the video to spread the word of Big Ten TED to the masses, and subscribe to the channel for updates on Big Ten content that drops every day.